The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Metropolitan General Hospital's emergency department on what had started as an ordinary Tuesday evening. The air carried that distinct hospital smell, a mix of disinfectant and stale coffee from the nurse's station. At the main desk, Dr. Mitchell was taking his sweet time organizing papers that honestly could have waited till later. His white coat was pristinely pressed, his posture rigid, and his face set in what the staff had come to recognize as his usual look of detached superiority. The relative quiet of the evening shattered when the emergency doors burst open. A mother rushed in, supporting her 12-year-old daughter, who was clearly struggling to breathe. The girl's hand clutched her chest, her face showing pure fear as she fought for each breath. Her mother, still in her teaching clothes, a simple blouse and skirt that suggested she'd come straight from her classroom, held her daughter close, panic written across her face. "Please, somebody help. My daughter can't breathe." The mother's voice cracked with desperation. Her daughter's wheezing could be heard across the emergency room, a harsh sound that made several heads turn. The girl's lips were starting to take on a bluish tinge, a clear sign that she wasn't getting enough oxygen. The night shift nurse immediately jumped into action, grabbing a wheelchair and rushing to help the young girl into it. She quickly checked the girl's vital signs, her experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency. The pulse oximeter she clipped onto the girl's finger showed dangerously low oxygen levels, numbers that would alarm any medical professional. "Dr. Mitchell," the nurse called out, her voice urgent but professional. "We need immediate assistance. Severe respiratory distress, oxygen saturation dropping rapidly." Dr. Mitchell looked up from his paperwork, his eyes moving slowly from the nurse to the mother and daughter. He made a show of shuffling the papers in his hands, deliberately taking his time to place them in a neat stack. The mother's eyes pleaded with him as her daughter's breathing became more labored. The nurse, reading the girl's vital signs again, felt her own heart rate increase. "Doctor, her stats are dropping. We need to act now." But Dr. Mitchell merely glanced at his watch, then back at his paperwork. "I'm quite busy with important documentation right now," he said, his tone dismissive. "The next attending physician will be here in about an hour. They can handle it then." He turned his back, making it clear he had no intention of helping. The mother's face crumpled in disbelief. "An hour? My daughter needs help now. Please, she's getting worse." Her voice trembled as she stroked her daughter's hair, trying to comfort her even as her own fear threatened to overwhelm her. The young girl's eyes were wide with terror as she struggled for each breath, her chest heaving with the effort. Her mother, who had spent the day teaching other people's children, now stood helpless as her own child suffered. Her hand gripped her daughter's tightly, feeling the slight tremors that ran through her child's body with each labored breath. The nurse's face hardened as she watched Dr. Mitchell's deliberate indifference. She had seen this behavior from him before, but never quite so blatant, never with a child's life hanging in the balance. The emergency room wasn't particularly busy. There was no valid medical reason for this delay. The truth of why he was refusing to help was written in every line of his posture, every dismissive glance he cast in their direction. Other patients in the waiting area began to murmur, some in confusion, others in growing anger. A security guard near the entrance shifted uncomfortably, clearly troubled by what he was witnessing. The atmosphere in the emergency room grew thick with tension as every passing second marked another moment the young girl struggled to breathe. The night shift nurse kept monitoring the girl's vitals, her jaw clenched tight as she watched the numbers continue to drop. She had worked in this hospital for years, had seen all kinds of emergencies, but watching a doctor willfully ignore a child in distress made her blood boil. She knew that every second counted in a case like this, knew that proper treatment needed to start immediately, not in an hour. As the girl's wheezing grew more pronounced, her mother's teaching bag slipped from her shoulder, spilling papers onto the floor. Homework she'd been planning to grade that evening. But none of that mattered now. Her entire world had narrowed to her daughter's struggling breaths and the doctor who stood just feet away, choosing to do nothing. The clock on the wall ticked forward, each second echoing in the tense atmosphere of the emergency room. Dr. Mitchell continued to shuffle papers, his back turned to the unfolding crisis, seemingly deaf to the sound of a young girl fighting for air and her mother's increasingly desperate pleas for help. Little did Dr. Mitchell know that his actions in these crucial moments would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only his life, but the entire hospital's approach to emergency care. As he stood there, prioritizing his prejudices over his Hippocratic oath, fate was preparing to teach him a lesson he would never forget. The emergency room's tension reached a breaking point as Dr. Mitchell continued to ignore the desperate situation unfolding behind him. The young girl's breathing had become so labored that each intake of air sounded like a whistle through a narrow reed. Her mother, still in her teaching clothes from a day spent nurturing other people's children, held her daughter's hand while fighting back tears of frustration and fear. The night shift nurse watched Dr. Mitchell's behavior with growing anger. She'd worked in emergency medicine for 15 years, and while she'd seen her share of difficult doctors, this was something else entirely. The casual cruelty of his indifference made her stomach turn. Her hands moved quickly, checking the girl's vital signs again, knowing full well that time was running out. "Doctor," she called out again, her voice firm and professional despite her rising anger. "Her oxygen saturation is now at 82%. We need to start treatment immediately." She emphasized each word, hoping to pierce through his wall of indifference. Dr. Mitchell barely turned his head. "I told you," he said, his voice dripping with irritation, "I'm busy with important documentation. These things need to be properly filed." He made a show of straightening papers that were already perfectly aligned, his back still turned to the struggling child. The mother, who had been trying to maintain her composure, finally broke. "My daughter is dying," she cried out, her voice echoing through the emergency room. How can paperwork be more important than her life? Her words carried the weight of every parent's worst nightmare, watching their child suffer while help was just feet away, yet somehow still out of reach. Other patients in the waiting area had stopped pretending to read their outdated magazines. An elderly man with a bandaged hand shook his head in disbelief. A pregnant woman whispered something to her husband, who looked like he wanted to jump up and do something, anything to help. The young girl's fingers had started to tremble as they gripped her mother's hand. Her eyes, wide with fear, darted around the room, silently pleading for someone to help her. Her chest heaved with each desperate attempt to draw in air, and the bluish tint around her lips had grown more pronounced. The nurse, still monitoring the girl's vitals, reached for her phone. Hospital protocol be damned, she wasn't going to stand by and watch this happen. But before she could make the call, Dr. Mitchell spoke again, his voice carrying that special kind of condescension reserved for people he considered beneath him. "If you are so concerned," he said, finally turning to face them, "you can wait for the next attending physician. I'm sure an hour won't make that much difference." His eyes barely glanced at the girl, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience in his perfectly ordered world. The mother's hands began to shake. She was used to handling difficult situations in her classroom, used to maintaining control when things got chaotic. But this was different. This was her baby girl fighting for every breath, while a man who had sworn to help others actively chose not to. "Please," she whispered, her teacher's authority crumbling under the weight of maternal desperation. "She's just a child. She's just a child who needs help." Dr. Mitchell's response was to pick up another stack of papers, making a point of checking his expensive watch. "As I said, the next attending physician will be here in about an hour. You'll just have to wait your turn." The nurse watched as he adjusted his pristine white coat, straightened his tie, and continued to ignore the crisis behind him. She'd seen plenty of doctors have bad days, seen them stressed or overwhelmed, but this was different. This was a choice. A deliberate decision to withhold care from a child who desperately needed it. The security guard by the entrance had moved closer, his face troubled as he watched the scene unfold. He'd been working at the hospital for 3 years and had never seen anything like this. His hand hovered near his radio. Unsure of what to do, what protocol to follow when a doctor was the one causing the emergency. The young girl's wheezing had become more pronounced, each breath a battle that seemed harder than the last. Her mother's teaching bag lay forgotten on the floor, student papers scattered around it like fallen leaves. One of the papers had a bright red A+ at the top, a reminder of the normal world that existed just hours ago, before this nightmare began. Several other hospital staff members had gathered at the edges of the scene, their faces showing a mix of horror and helplessness. They'd all seen Dr. Mitchell's behavior before, his subtle dismissals, his convenient absences when certain patients needed help, but never anything this blatant, never anything this cruel. The clock on the wall continued its relentless march forward, each tick seeming to mock the increasingly desperate situation. The mother looked around the emergency room, seeking anyone who might help, anyone who might step in and do what this doctor refused to do. What Dr. Mitchell didn't realize as he stood there protecting his prejudices with paperwork was that his actions weren't just cruel, they were about to catch up with him in a way he never could have imagined. The universe has a way of balancing its scales, and sometimes the lessons it teaches come from the most unexpected directions. None of them knew it yet, but in just a few minutes, everything would change. Dr. Mitchell's carefully constructed world of privilege and prejudice was about to come crashing down around him, and the catalyst for that change was already in motion. As the emergency room teetered on the edge of chaos, the night shift nurse made a decision that would change everything. She'd spent years building her career, carefully following protocols and respecting the hospital hierarchy. But watching a child struggle to breathe while a doctor deliberately ignored her, that was a line she refused to cross. With steady hands that belied her internal turmoil, she pulled out her phone and quickly dialed the hospital administrator's number. Her voice was low but clear as she described the situation. At the same time, she opened the patient documentation system on the nearby computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she recorded every detail of what was happening. I need to document this in real time, she thought, knowing that such records could make all the difference later. The timestamp on each entry would tell its own story: when the girl arrived, when help was requested, and how long Dr. Mitchell chose to ignore a child in crisis. The young girl's breathing had become even more labored, each gasp a little shorter than the last. Her mother had started praying quietly, tears streaming down her face as she stroked her daughter's hair. The girl's school backpack lay abandoned on the floor, a math worksheet spilling out, normal life scattered around them like broken glass. The emergency room had grown eerily quiet. Other patients watched the scene unfold, many recording with their phones, their own ailments temporarily forgotten in the face of such blatant negligence. An older woman in a wheelchair couldn't stop shaking her head, muttering, "Lord." Other staff members began coming forward, quietly sharing similar stories, times when Dr. Mitchell had been too busy to treat certain patients, times when his care seemed to depend more on the patient's appearance than their medical needs. The wall of silence that had protected him for so long was crumbling. The young girl was starting to stabilize, her breathing becoming more regular with each passing minute. The new doctor stayed by her side, monitoring her closely while simultaneously ordering additional tests to determine what had triggered the severe respiratory distress. The mother, still holding her daughter's hand, looked up at the new doctor with gratitude shining through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for helping my baby." Dr. Mitchell, sensing the shifting atmosphere in the emergency room, began gathering his things. But the hospital administrator stepped in front of him, her face stern. "I need to see you in my office immediately," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The other patients in the waiting room had witnessed everything. Their phones had captured it all: the refusal of care, the arrival of help, the stark difference between right and wrong played out in real time. Some were already posting on social media, their outrage spreading beyond the hospital walls. What no one knew yet was that this incident would become a turning point, not just for this hospital, but for the entire medical community in their city. And for Dr. Mitchell, it was only the beginning of a day that would force him to confront his own prejudices in the most personal way possible. But right now, in this moment, what mattered most was that a young girl was breathing easier, her mother could finally relax her grip on her daughter's hand, and the right kind of doctor had stepped up when it mattered most. Just as Dr. Mitchell was about to follow the hospital administrator to her office, his phone rang. The sound cut through the emergency room's tense atmosphere like a knife. He almost ignored it, but something made him glance at the screen. His face, already flushed with anger, suddenly drained of all color. "Your daughter's been in an accident," said the voice on the other end. "She's being rushed to Central Hospital. It's serious. You need to get there now." The phone nearly slipped from his trembling fingers. His daughter, his precious little girl who had just started high school, who played violin in the school orchestra, who wanted to follow in his footsteps and become a doctor someday, was hurt. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The same fear he had just ignored in another parent's eyes now reflected in his own. He looked around the emergency room, seeing it differently now. The young girl he had refused to help was breathing easier under the care of the other doctor, her mother's face awash with relief. That could have been his daughter. That could have been him, desperate for help that didn't come. I need to go, he stammered to the administrator. My daughter, there's been an accident. His perfectly pressed white coat suddenly felt like it was suffocating him. The administrator's face softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Go. But this isn't over. We'll discuss your actions when you return. She watched as he grabbed his keys with shaking hands, nearly dropping them twice. As he rushed toward the exit, he passed the mother whose daughter he had refused to treat. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment he saw something that shook him to his core. Not anger or hatred, but pity. She recognized the fear in his eyes, the same fear she had felt just minutes ago. The drive to Central Hospital was a blur. Every red light felt like an eternity. His mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. Was she conscious? How bad was the accident? Would someone help her right away, or would they? He couldn't finish the thought. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The same hands that had just refused to help a child in need now trembled at the thought of his own daughter waiting for help. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he couldn't dwell on it. Not now. Not when his baby girl needed him. When he finally reached Central Hospital's emergency entrance, he nearly forgot to put his car in park before jumping out. The automatic doors seemed to move in slow motion as he rushed through them, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. My daughter, he gasped at the reception desk. She was in an accident. They said they were bringing her here. His voice, usually so controlled and dismissive, cracked with emotion. Please take a seat, sir, the receptionist said. The doctor will be with you shortly. The words hit him like a physical blow. Take a seat. Wait, but this was his daughter. Didn't they understand? He opened his mouth to protest, to demand immediate attention, to pull rank as a fellow physician, and suddenly stopped. How many times had he said those exact same words to desperate families? How many times had he made them wait while he attended to more important matters? The realization made him sink into a hard plastic chair, his legs no longer able to support him. Minutes stretched like hours. Each time the emergency doors opened, his head snapped up, hoping to see his daughter being brought in. Instead, he saw other families, other emergencies. A construction worker with a bleeding hand. An elderly woman struggling to breathe. A teenager holding his arm at an odd angle. Each person's pain and fear as real as his own. His phone buzzed again, the hospital administrator from his own hospital. He let it go to voicemail. Social media notifications started popping up on his screen. Videos were already circulating of his earlier behavior, but none of that seemed important now. All that mattered was his daughter. Finally, a doctor approached him. Young, confident, with kind eyes that reminded him of how he used to be back when he first took the Hippocratic Oath. The doctor's scrubs were wrinkled, suggesting they'd been on shift for hours, but their attention was fully focused on him. Mr. Mitchell, the doctor said, and he noticed they didn't use his title, didn't know he was a fellow physician. He was just another worried parent now, his status and position meaningless in the face of his child's emergency. As he waited to hear news about his daughter, the weight of his earlier actions pressed down on him like a physical thing. In the same hour that he had refused to help a child in need, he found himself completely dependent on other medical professionals to save his own daughter. The universe, it seemed, had a peculiar sense of timing. And as he sat there, surrounded by the controlled chaos of an emergency room he didn't control, Dr. Mitchell began to understand something that would change him forever. But first, he had to hear whether his daughter would be okay. And in those moments of waiting, he experienced exactly what he had forced another parent to endure. The emergency room at Central Hospital buzzed with activity as Dr. Mitchell sat hunched in his plastic chair, his usually perfect posture crumpled by worry. Every beep of a monitor, every squeak of rubber-soled shoes against the linoleum floor made him flinch. His phone had stopped buzzing. The battery had died an hour ago, but he couldn't bring himself to care about the missed calls from his hospital's administration. The young doctor who had first spoken to him returned, clipboard in hand. "Your daughter's stable," they said, and Dr. Mitchell felt his knees go weak with relief. "She has a concussion, a broken arm, and some cuts and bruises, but she's going to be fine. We're running a few more tests just to be thorough. Can I see her?" The words tumbled out before the doctor could finish speaking. His voice, usually so commanding, sounded small and scared. The doctor checked their charts. "She's still having some tests done. It'll be about an hour before you can see her." They paused, then added kindly, "I know waiting is hard, but we need to be thorough. I promise she's in good hands." An hour. The same amount of time he had told that mother to wait while her daughter struggled to breathe. The irony wasn't lost on him as he sank back into his chair, the minutes crawling by like years. He watched as other doctors and nurses moved through the emergency room with purpose and compassion. A doctor knelt down to explain a procedure to a frightened child at eye level. A nurse took extra time to help an elderly patient understand their medication instructions. This was how medicine was supposed to be practiced, with humanity, with care, with respect for every patient regardless of who they were. His attention was drawn to a doctor treating a young boy with a deep cut on his forehead. The doctor was explaining each step of the treatment to both the child and his anxious father, their dark skin a shade deeper than his daughter's patient's had been. The care and attention the doctor showed them was exactly the same as what was being given to his own daughter. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had become the very opposite of what he'd sworn to be when he took his medical oath. Somewhere along the way, he had lost not just his compassion, but his basic humanity. When had he started seeing some lives as worth less than others? When had he become so corrupted by his own prejudices that he would let a child suffer? A commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A family rushed in with their grandmother, who was having chest pains. The attending doctor, a younger man with warm brown skin and a gentle manner, immediately took charge of the situation. He didn't see a white family or a black family or an Asian family. He just saw people who needed help. Dr. Mitchell watched as the doctor worked, his movements efficient but gentle, his voice calm and reassuring. He spoke to the grandmother with respect, listened to her concerns, and explained everything he was doing. This was a doctor who remembered why he had chosen this profession in the first place. Time continued to crawl by. Dr. Mitchell found himself studying every interaction in the emergency room, seeing things he had become blind to in his own practice. A custodian gently helping a lost child find their way back to their parents' room. A receptionist taking extra time to explain insurance paperwork to a confused elderly man. A medical student staying after their shift to comfort a frightened patient. His phone lay dark and dead in his pocket, but he could imagine what was happening at his own hospital. The videos of his behavior would have spread by now. His colleagues would be watching them, disgusted. The hospital board would be meeting to discuss his actions. His career, which he had built so carefully over decades, might very well be over. And somehow, sitting here waiting for news about his own child, none of that seemed as important as it should have. All he could think about was that mother's face as she begged him to help her daughter. All he could hear was his own dismissive voice telling her to wait, as if her child's life meant nothing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor returned. "You can see her now," they said, leading him through the emergency room. As they walked, Dr. Mitchell noticed how the doctor greeted every patient they passed with the same warm smile, the same genuine concern. When he reached his daughter's room, he paused in the doorway. She looked so small in the hospital bed, her arm in a cast, scratches on her face. The sight made his heart clench. But she was alive, she was being cared for, she was getting the help she needed, all because doctors here had done what he had refused to do for someone else's child. The young doctor who had treated his daughter appeared at his side. They didn't know he was a fellow physician, didn't treat him with any special deference. They just saw a worried father whose child needed help. And in that moment, Dr. Mitchell realized that was exactly how it should be. As he sat by his daughter's bedside, holding her uninjured hand while she slept, the full weight of his actions earlier that day pressed down on him. He had nearly let a child suffer because of his prejudices, while other doctors had saved his own daughter without a second thought about who she was or who her father might be. The universe had taught him a lesson in the most pointed way possible. But as he watched his daughter's chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath, he knew that the real test would come in what he did with this understanding going forward. The next morning, after making sure his daughter was stable and resting comfortably, Dr. Mitchell drove back to Metropolitan General Hospital. The familiar building, where he had worked for over 15 years, suddenly looked different to him. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as he walked toward the entrance, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what he had to face. News vans were already parked outside the hospital. Reporters stood with microphones, doing their morning broadcasts. As he approached, several of them recognized him from the viral videos that had spread overnight. "Dr. Mitchell, do you have any comment about your refusal to treat a child yesterday? What do you have to say about the allegations of discrimination?" He walked past them without comment, his feet feeling like lead with each step. The security guard at the entrance, who usually greeted him with a respectful nod, now watched him with undisguised disappointment. Inside, the usual morning bustle of the hospital felt different. Conversations stopped when he passed, and staff members who normally smiled at him now turned away. The hospital administrator was waiting in her office, along with 2 members of the hospital board. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning as he took a seat across from them. On the administrator's desk, a tablet showed one of the viral videos from yesterday, his own voice, cold and dismissive, telling a desperate mother to wait while her child struggled to breathe. "This isn't the first complaint about your behavior," the administrator began, her voice firm but controlled. "But it is by far the most serious. We have multiple videos, witness statements, and detailed documentation of your refusal to provide emergency care to a child in respiratory distress." She slid several papers across the desk. "We've also received numerous reports from staff members about previous incidents of discriminatory behavior. People who were afraid to speak up before are coming forward now." Dr. Mitchell looked down at the papers. Incident after incident, pattern after pattern, all laid out in black and white. Patients he had made wait unnecessarily. People he had dismissed or treated with less care. Lives he had potentially put at risk because of his own prejudices. "Your medical license is under review by the State Medical Board," one of the board members added. "Until they make their decision, you are suspended from all duties at this hospital. We've already contacted legal counsel about the potential liability issues." The administrator leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Did you know that the mother you dismissed yesterday is a beloved teacher at Lincoln Elementary? That she's taught hundreds of children in this community? That some of those children are now our nurses and medical technicians?" Dr. Mitchell felt his chest tighten. He hadn't known. He hadn't cared to know. He had seen only what his prejudices had allowed him to see. "The videos have been viewed millions of times," the other board member said. "Our hospital is facing a public relations crisis. But more importantly, we've failed in our fundamental mission to provide care to everyone who needs it." His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably another message from his wife about their daughter. His daughter, who was alive and recovering because doctors at another hospital had done exactly what he had refused to do. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw things differently last night, when it was my child who needed help." The administrator's face softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "A change of heart because your own child was in danger doesn't excuse what you did. Actions have consequences, doctor." She was right. He knew she was right. The magnitude of what he had done, not just yesterday, but over years of practicing medicine, settled over him like a heavy blanket. Outside the office, the hospital continued its daily rhythm. He could hear the overhead announcements, the squeaking of gurney wheels, the distant conversations of staff and patients. Life and death decisions were being made every minute, lives being saved or lost based on the split-second choices of medical professionals. "We're implementing new anti-discrimination policies," the administrator continued. "Mandatory training for all staff. Better reporting systems for patients who experience discrimination. Your actions have forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our institution." Dr. Mitchell nodded slowly. "What about the girl?" he asked. "The one from yesterday. She's recovered well, no thanks to you," the administrator replied. "The other doctor who stepped in provided the care you should have given immediately. She's home with her family now." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by shame. He had nearly let a child suffer because of his prejudices. How many others had suffered because of his biases over the years? The medical board hearing will be next week, one of the board members said. I suggest you take this time to really think about whether you still deserve the privilege of being a doctor. As he left the office, his medical badge and hospital ID confiscated, Dr. Mitchell felt oddly lighter. Not because he had escaped punishment, he hadn't, and he knew more consequences were coming, but because for the first time in years, he was seeing clearly. Staff members watched him walk through the halls one last time. Some looked angry, others disappointed, a few seemed satisfied at his downfall. But it was the looks of hurt that affected him the most, the betrayal in the eyes of colleagues who had trusted him to live up to his oath as a doctor. In the parking lot, the reporters were still waiting, but he barely noticed them. His mind was on his daughter, recovering in another hospital, and on the young girl he had refused to help. 2 children, both deserving of care, both equally valuable. How had he ever seen it any other way? 3 months passed like a slow-moving river. The medical board's decision had been firm but fair. Dr. Mitchell's license wasn't permanently revoked, but he would need to complete extensive rehabilitation before he could practice again. The requirements included mandatory sensitivity training, community service hours at inner-city clinics, and regular evaluations of his progress. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the community health clinic where he now volunteered. It was a small building in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, always busy, always understaffed. He wasn't allowed to practice medicine here, but he could help with paperwork, organization, and basic patient assistance. Today, like every day for the past 2 months, he sat at the front desk, helping people fill out forms and navigate the complicated healthcare system he had once been part of. His expensive suits had been replaced by simple casual clothes, his commanding presence softened by humility. An elderly woman struggled through the door, leaning heavily on her cane. Without hesitation, he got up to help her to a chair. 3 months ago, he might have ignored her, might have expected someone else to help. Now he understood that every small act of kindness mattered. "Thank you, young man," she said, patting his hand. She didn't know he had once been a prominent doctor. Here, he was just another person trying to help, and somehow that felt right. The clinic's waiting room slowly filled with patients, parents with sick children, elderly folks needing prescription refills, workers seeking treatment before their shifts. Each face told a story, each person carried their own worries and hopes. He had learned to see them all, really see them, not just as patients but as people. His daughter visited him during his lunch break, her arm now free of its cast. She had recovered fully from the accident, thanks to the excellent care she had received. "Dad," she said, unwrapping her sandwich, "remember that girl? The one from that night?" How could he forget? The memory still kept him awake at night. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I saw her at school today," his daughter continued. "She's in the grade below me. She's really nice. She plays basketball and wants to be a doctor someday." The words hit him like a physical blow. That girl, the one he had almost let suffer, wanted to be a doctor. Would she remember his cruelty when she took her own Hippocratic oath? Would it make her a better doctor than he had been? After lunch, he attended his required sensitivity training session. Today's topic was unconscious bias in healthcare. Once he would have dismissed such training as unnecessary. Now he listened intently, taking notes, recognizing patterns in his own past behavior. The trainer, a respected healthcare advocate, shared statistics about healthcare disparities. But it wasn't the numbers that moved him, it was the stories. Stories of people denied care, of lives lost to prejudice, of trust broken between communities and healthcare providers. Later that afternoon, back at the clinic, he helped a young mother understand her child's vaccination schedule. She was working 2 jobs, trying to keep up with her children's healthcare needs. 3 months ago, he might have been impatient with her questions. Now he took the time to explain everything clearly, making sure she understood each detail. "You're different from most people at doctors' offices," she told him. "You actually listen." The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. He had to lose everything to learn how to listen. That evening, as he was preparing to leave, a familiar face walked through the clinic doors. It was the mother from that night, the teacher whose daughter he had refused to help. His heart stopped for a moment, shame washing over him. She was bringing in a box of donated supplies for the clinic. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Then she said simply, "I heard you were volunteering here." "I'm sorry," he blurted out, the words he had wanted to say for months finally coming out. "What I did that night, there's no excuse." She looked at him for a long moment. "No, there isn't," she agreed. "But I heard about your daughter's accident. About how it changed you. My students tell me you've been helping their families here at the clinic." He swallowed hard. "I'm trying to do better. To be better." She nodded slowly. "That's all any of us can do." She set down the box of supplies and turned to leave, then paused. "My daughter, she still wants to be a doctor. I hope when she is, the medical world will be better than it was that night." After she left, he sat alone in the quiet clinic, thinking about how much had changed. His old life, the prestigious position, the respect of his colleagues, the authority he had wielded so carelessly, was gone. But something new was growing in its place: understanding, humility, and a deeper appreciation for what it truly meant to help others. His phone buzzed with a message from the medical board. His next evaluation was scheduled for next week. He didn't know if he would ever practice medicine again, but he had learned that healing came in many forms. Sometimes it meant writing prescriptions and performing procedures. Sometimes it meant simply being there, listening, showing kindness to those in need. Outside, the sun was setting over the city. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new stories, new opportunities to prove that change was possible. It wasn't redemption. He knew that would take much longer, but it was a start.